Years ago, my friend was working at an accountant office, and during tax season time, and they were swamped with work trying to meet the deadlines for tax time for all their clients. And so the boss's wife, Marlene, came into work to help answer the phones to allow the rest of the staff to look after all the paperwork. Sadly, it seemed Marlene was having a very intense day, answering many of the never-ending questions all over the phone. By mid-afternoon, she finally let out her frustrations on somebody who was on the phone with her, who had been calling several times that day, asking the same question. Now, Marlene knew that she should not have responded this way, but it was too late. And so an hour later, a gentleman came into the office and stood at the front desk and loudly demanded to know who the person he spoke to earlier that day. You could have heard a pin drop in that office. Finally, Marlene stood up and admitted that she was the person that he had talked to, and she was very sorry for her response, for the way that she earlier on the phone with him. The gentleman placed a teacup and saucer with a beautiful arrangement of flowers in front of her on the desk and said to her, "Here, you must be having a bad day." Poor Marlene was reduced to tears by the man's generosity and understanding. In our gospel, Jesus describes himself as meek and humble in heart. But like Marlene and many of us, we all struggle to be gentle and humble in heart, meek and humble in heart, especially in the midst of frustration or feelings of failure. It's really easy to be meek when life is going very smoothly. But the true test comes when we find ourselves in times of conflict, crisis, or even pressure. Part of that conflict or crisis is what St. Paul speaks to us in that second reading today. He reminds us that we are not in the flesh, but we are in the Spirit. And if by the Spirit we put to death the deeds of the body. People who live in the flesh place a huge value on attractiveness, dominance, wealth, or even fame. Being in the flesh is always egotistic and isolates the individual as much as it harms others as well. But our gospel, Jesus is giving each and every one of us a very personal invitation. Come to me and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. Meekness is what Jesus displayed during his passion, since, according to St. Peter, Jesus returned no insult and did not threaten, and instead handed himself over to the one who judges justly. Even in our first reading from Zechariah, Jesus is portrayed as this mounted king, as a peaceful king, a peaceful ruler. He is a king who is described as meek. How often have we heard of a king being described as meek? How often do we describe others as being meek? But Jesus recognizes that God is his strength, and God will provide the power to carry out his mission. In other words, Jesus has been invited by his Father to take his yoke upon him. In doing so, Jesus finds rest. He takes the yoke and walks with his Father so that they are one. In the same way, Jesus invites you and I, each of us, to take his yoke, to learn from him, to learn to say thank you, as Jesus did. Thank you for the little ones, Jesus says, the people who are teachable, those who see themselves as needing to grow. These are the ones who understand Christ's message. Jesus is saying, do as I do, trust as I do. So we can learn from him, so we can find rest, so we can be one with him. When I hear Jesus say those words in the gospel, "Learn from me," I imagine myself sitting at the feet of Jesus, much like the disciples, and I am humbled by such a powerful teacher. So here are a few things that I've learned from Jesus. When I started here as a pastor 7 years ago, I found myself reacting to things being said to me rather than pondering them like Mary did. Karen, our parish secretary, always seemed to have news for me when I returned back to the office, and I found myself verbally reacting to that news and realized that Karen's just simply the messenger. That's when I asked God to help me to stay calm like Mary, and to ponder the daily news that I might receive. So now that I have taken his yoke, I walk much more quietly and certainly at peace. Another thing I learned that, like many people, we struggle with anxiety and worry. What if I fall? What if people don't agree with me? What if people don't like me? Jesus taught me to pray for those that I struggle to understand, those with whom I don't always agree. When I pray for them, I find that my focus is no longer on my anxiety, but on the need for the other that I'm praying for, that God may strengthen them as well as me, and even provide healing for them or even for myself. This practice of prayer, praying for others, has calmed my anxiety and even allowed me to sleep at night. Thirdly, I've often found myself to be led by fear, rather than to be filled with God's joyful peace. I was always afraid to ask for help. Even in the classroom, I would be the last one to raise my hand. I'd wait for somebody else to ask the question. We all do it. We've all been there. We're afraid we might ask a stupid question, everybody will laugh at us. Jesus taught me not to be afraid to ask for help. And so earlier this year, Bishop Fabro had asked me to be the new pastor for the families of parishes, for the Lake Huron Catholic family of parishes. As soon as he asked me, the question started in my mind. What if I mess this up? What if... Thankfully, I was more excited about the news rather than fearful. But last month, I found the courage to write to Bishop Fabro, to write my concerns to him about this new family of parishes, but also to share my enthusiasm about this family of parishes. I was concerned that I might not have enough help with 6 parishes. But even before I sent the letter, Deacon Dennis Rive from the diocese called me and asked me if I wanted the help of a deacon. And of course he asked me if Deacon John Lammers could help us. Of course I said yes. And I started to realize I haven't even sent the letter yet, and God's already responding for my request for help. And so the day after I sent the letter, Bishop Fabro called me, and even Bishop Joseph called me as well. Both of them acknowledging my concerns. And of course, they offered a retired priest in the area that might be able to help us when one of us is either on vacation or not feeling well as well. And so Jesus taught me not to be afraid to ask for help. When Jesus invites us to take his yoke and learn from him, he's inviting us to learn from his prayer, to learn from his meekness, to learn from his rejoicing in God's gracious and surprising will. Jesus says that to learn from him means to learn how to discover, how to accept, and how to do God's will. Those who give themselves to God, who take on Jesus' yoke, imitate his humility. They no longer need to worry about carrying out their own agenda or being successful or even a failure. They can rest assured in the assurance that God's will, God's gracious will, is being accomplished even when, or perhaps especially when, we do not see the results. That indeed is an easy yoke for which we need to do no more than simply thank God.